Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and welcome, and thank you for joining the call tonight. As Kate said, we usually do this in person, and normally structured to be highly engaging, but we will flex here and deliver it in this format. I'm just going to echo what she said. If you have a question, please ask it. In person, we don't want me to drone on. That's worse in a Zoom format. So if you have a question, please ask it. And what I'm going to try to do is just get set up here. Kate, I'm going to share my screen and just make sure everybody can see it. How's that? And hopefully, if you see a title slide, see some heads nodding. That's good. Perfect.
Yes.
All right. Just a little background as we go through it. As Kate said, I've spent a number of years kind of working with teams. When I was at Verizon, I ran an internal consulting group. One of the things we did was team effectiveness consulting. That was everything from senior teams, executive leaders, all the way through frontline supervisors and their teams in the field. The other thing that I've run into across the years is, as Kate mentioned, actually I had 15 years teaching executive education at the Koch School of Business. And so that was in the Collins Center eventually, but I started doing that before there was a Collins Center. And a lot of good friends and colleagues still from my SMU time. And one of the things that does over 15 years is it gives you a large sample set to talk to leaders across a lot of different industries. So I want to try to bring some of that to the discussion. When I went to Link Simulation and Training in Arlington, I was responsible for leadership development and training and development, but eventually led the HR function. And I want to bring some of that experience to the table as well. You'll find that I'm going to try to be as practical as I can. All of you have team experience. All of you have been on teams that were highly effective. You have your own thoughts and your experience on that, which I'd love to hear. What I'm going to try to do is take you on a little tour of the things that I've seen work well. As Kate mentioned, right now my responsibilities are across town in Fort Worth at TCU, where I run the executive education business and also get in the classroom to teach on this and some other subjects. And again, that allows me to talk to our partners, to a lot of area organizations on what do they see in challenges for teams. And like you, I've been on teams. I've led large teams, small teams, virtual teams across organizational boundaries, across geographic and country boundaries, and we'll try to bring you what I think are the highly important leverage points as we do that. And again, stop me anywhere, ask some questions. Kate, I know you volunteered. If you see something in the chat room and I think we should address it on, please stop me. And I will also pause as we go through this and just try to ask your thoughts. She didn't mention, but you're going to see there's a quiz tonight, and that's in the middle of it. The good news is it's true, false, and it's 5 questions. So I think we're going to get through it. But let me start this way. When I was at Link Simulation and Training, that business is in Arlington. What we did is we built training and flight simulators for military and commercial aircraft. It was a fabulous place to be. There's 3,000 people across 90 locations around the world. And we built the world's coolest video games that had such an important impact and training function for our clients. So we did, you can see on the slide, that's the B-2 bomber. We did C-17, that's a large body aircraft, helicopter platforms, fighter jets. On the commercial side, we do Boeing 767 through 787 and Airbus kinds of things. Very interesting business. And over in Arlington, that's 4 blocks from the ballpark. And when I left that business, I was responsible for HR. And so in that delivery of all those high-tech, high-performance, state-of-the-art adaptive learning situations, we had 600 engineers who were 4 blocks from the ballpark in Arlington, and we delivered all those programs in teams. Now those teams, all the resources sat in a homeroom under the guidance of one manager, Mary Ann Barnum. And the teams would form and disband based on whatever the customer need was. We had teams that could be together for 2 years, and we had teams that could be together for 2 weeks or 2 months. It really just depended on what did the customer need and what were the outcomes that we were trying to drive. And so when you're in an environment like that, you have to get really good at starting up teams and managing them to high performance, disbanding. You have to do coaching and development and everything on the fly, and you have to involve a lot of people to do it. So if I were to start by saying, okay, what made that work well? I would say there were 3 things, and we're going to explore those 3 things tonight. But the things that I think that worked really well in those teams were purpose. Everybody knew the mission of the company. I had the privilege of doing all of our employee surveys. And we had employee engagement numbers that were 20 plus points higher than what was the national average at the time. And part of the reason was everybody knew that what we did allowed the crews, either in a commercial flight or in a military flight or mission, to operate safely and come back home safely and do that in a way that achieved the results they want to do. Everybody from the people who have been there 40 years to 40 months, all were aligned around the importance of what we did in the safety and quality aspects of it. So that helped focus everybody on the team. The other thing that was really important was culture. And along with knowing and understanding the importance of the why, the mission, people were very familiar with the how we were going to get it done. And in particular, and I'm sure where you are, you hear it in every organization, what's the language of the culture. At Link, we were not going to be late, and we were going to come in under budget, and it was going to meet or exceed the customer expectations, and everybody was aligned around that. So one of the things you'll hear me talk about tonight is alignment and how do you get there. I'm going to reference different books along the way that I think are interesting. I'll tell you why I thought they were interesting. I'll tell you whether you should read the whole thing or just read the cover, but I'll kind of point those things out. Now, the third thing, and maybe the hardest thing to get around, was the person who led the homeroom of all these resources. And her name was Marianne Barna. She was fantastic, but she paid attention to the process. How do these teams work? Who was responsible for the care and feeding of these teams? What did we do when they started up? How did we manage their arc toward high performance? When we disbanded it, what happened to the folks? How did we transition to another team? It's this paying attention to the process, the how the teams work together, that is often not cared for really well. There's a professor at Stanford, his name is Jeffrey Treffer, and he's written a number of books. But one of the things he said once upon a time that I love and I've tried to pay attention to is really the difference between good companies and great companies, is that great companies actually do what they say they're going to do. So one of the themes you're going to hear me talk about in practice and reality, if I ask what makes great and really highly effective teams, chances are we're all going to get the answer right. So part of the challenge is really more around why don't we see that happen more often, and what gets in our way as leaders as we try to lead teams to be high performance teams. So I'm going to keep going here as we go through. Please ask questions. One of the things I want to do is give you a context for teams that we see in our practice at TCU, and certainly I saw it while I was teaching executive at SMU. And these are familiar themes. What you see on the screen are things that are happening in different industries, some of which are near and dear to our hearts, and some are a little far over the field. The picture on the top left is a mock-up of something that would be urban air transport. And you see companies like Bell Helicopter paying a lot of attention to adjacent markets and what are new opportunities. What's interesting is you see companies like Toyota, who's invested over $400 million in the possibility of this as a form of transportation. And one of the ways they get there is they put together teams that have to act very, very quickly to take a look at adjacent markets or disruptive opportunities, and it has to move very quickly. That's a theme I'm going to repeat, because as we talk about what makes highly effective teams, the art of being able to move quickly puts a lot of pressure on them. So we'll talk about what makes that successful. If I move over on your screen a little bit to the right, that's a picture of a telemedicine appointment, which is absolutely fascinating. So we have a partner in the Metroplex who's a very large healthcare system. And when we started working with them 3 or 4 years ago, they were trying to think about, well, this telemedicine is really going to become very large and big. And we have to figure out, how do we deliver quality care in that environment? How can we build a business model around that? And then how do we scale this thing? Because we think we're going to have to scale this, right? And so they actually put together a small team that took a look at the entry into that market for them. So it wasn't what you might see in some larger organizations where you have a strategy person and people are responsible for lines of business and you have a large organizational structure. It was a team, a very small team, that decided, here's what we think this looks like for us, and here's how we're going to enter that particular market. What's fascinating to me is during the month of April this year, as we entered what is probably the second or third month of the pandemic here, they did 10,000 virtual visits just in the month of April. That's 3 or 4 years ago talking about we might want to be in this business to a very large scale very quickly. A lot of pressure on them to do that. The bottom screen, of course, is what we're all doing tonight. You see this in higher ed, right? You see a flex of how do we quickly do that. You've experienced firsthand well, SMU has done that, the things they've learned along the way. We're doing the same thing across the Metroplex at TCU, learning a lot of lessons and trying to think about how does it inform where we go. And all this depended on really the work of teams to operate very quickly to get us to a place where we can deliver something new. That's obviously not going to go away. We see that as a really important trend that's going to affect how teams operate in the workplace. And this particular slide, if you're looking for what is a nice resource, a really nice resource for how you can think about the future of work and where it's going, aside from the course which you're hearing in your MBA program at SMU, Deloitte Insights is a fantastic place to get some of that. John Hagel is a guy who runs their Center for the Edge, is what they call it. He's always on the edge of what are the trends we're seeing out there. The evolution of work it's a body of thought that you see across a lot of different organizations that talks about as we see the future of work evolve, as we see data analytics, as we see AI, as we see robotics, what's going to be the change in the nature of jobs and the change in the nature of work that we all experience. And I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but essentially the value that we are going to be able to create, you all know this already, you're all doing this and you're learning about it, is how do we independently create value? How do we think about non-standard kinds of situations? How do we creatively think about where we want to go? How can we flex our paradigms around business models? The thought there is that the type of work that we'll all be doing is non-routine. And non-routine work focuses on a lot of autonomy. You're going to hear me talk about autonomy a great deal tonight because it's one of those things that make highly effective teams work really well. It's also one of those things that leaders have a tough time enabling people and letting go. We're going to talk about some of the barriers there. But I wanted to spend just a brief time on these two slides to say that the world of which organizations are adapting and moving in is changing very quickly. So what we see as we shift with our clients is what I saw at Link and some of the other things at Verizon in my corporate life. So everything's shifting, it's speeding up. There's a lot of focus on agility and adaptability, and you've heard all these things. So as we go through the things I think drive some of this tonight, what I want to talk about is what are the things in effective teams that kind of drive their ability to do that? What do we see that's going to help them? What did Google learn when they did a fairly large study on what makes effective teams? What's the latest on the science of some of this stuff? And how can we think about taking some of that back to what you do and thinking about where you want to go with it? So let me pause just a second. And Kate, I don't know if there are any questions in the chat box, but I want to see if there's any questions as I start and keep going through this.
There was one question, and I'm not quite sure which company, but you'll know. It said, was the company Caraloop or Caraloop?
Was the company Caraloop?
C-A-R-I-L-O-O-P.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with that company.
All right, that's all the questions we had. Anybody have any questions you want to pipe up with right now? Feel free. Otherwise, Jim will keep going.
All right, I'm going to keep going here. So the central question I really want to kind of get into is why do some teams work better than others, right? And if you go around, a lot of either the popular press or some of the academic studies, you're going to see a number of different themes, right? That New York Times article on the upper left around what Google learned from its quest to build the perfect team is very interesting. And, they're going to start out by talking about psychological safety and what's the environment you create as you come together as a team so that you can make decisions and even disagree with each other in a way that fosters effective outcomes. In the middle of the science of teamwork is studies around by Deloitte and others around literally the makeup of the team. And they're thinking about what is a diverse set of talents and a diverse set of perspectives and paradigms that will allow you to innovate and think differently about problems and how you balance the strengths and the composition of your team. And if we go around this whole piece, there's some very, very common themes as we go through this. And what I really want to do is think about what did I learn in practice? What do we see over at TCU? What do we talk about at SMU? What were the experiences I had as a leader in different places that told me, hey, these things are really important and they work, right? So I've had a number of leaders who were very, very good at the starting out with the why. And walking through that. We had a number of leaders talking about the how and really pay attention to that. I'm going to share some of those things as we go through this. And the place I would start is this way. I would say leading on purpose essentially means leading with the why. And you already know and have had programs about organizational behavior and motivation. But why the team exists and the purpose that imbues in the people and the outcomes you derive when you do that are absolutely critical. This is a big differentiator. I think one of the things I would say is most of the teams I've been at have been so results focused, which is a strength unless you overplay it, but they don't always back up to communicate well, to focus on how they work, and really to focus on the why. So quick story on something I ran into. I had a chance over the course of about 5 years to attend what was the Chief Learning Officer Forum, hosted by our friends at Deloitte, and they hosted that over in Westlake at Deloitte University. I don't know if you've had a chance to be there, but it is essentially it's a $300 million leadership development conference center they use primarily for their own folks. Their strength, their skills are in their people, their human capital. That's their competitive advantage. And so they invest a lot of money in that. But they opened it up to their clients, of which we were one at the time while I was at L3, to have their learning folks come over and talk about best practices and what was the next step in corporate learning. And one of the things they were nice enough to share was their perspective and how they trained their consultants. And in their vernacular, they talked about moments of impact. And they were very, very compelling around it. They were very focused around it. And they really believed it made a difference in their business. And they thought about impact in two ways. They said, we have really important moments of impact for our clients, the customers we serve, and the other set of people we really focus our time on the impact we have in moments that matter, our own employees. How we engage them, how we teach them, how we grow them. But then what they said is they always lead with purpose. They always lead with what do they want to accomplish, why do they want to do that, and how do they want to impact whoever they're kind of interacting with. And that's something that they had and they really focused on in their culture. And I found as I worked with teams, particularly when we were had our own team effectiveness consulting practice, and this was not always done because it's hard work and because it's continual work. So if I play that out just a little bit, and if I, along the way here, what I'll try to do is give you some things I think you should think about, some of which I'm sure you're already doing. If you have any questions, please ask them as we go through here. On the right are a couple of interesting resources. Strategy and Business, and now called Strategy and, is a really interesting publication. And they have this short article about what gets you up in the morning. And it was a flip of a common thing you'll hear around leaders say what keeps them up at night, right? But in this case, they were trying to think about, well, what gets you up in the morning? Why do you do what you do? Which is really kind of interesting. And you can see some questions here that I've listed out, and this comes from experiences. And in the consulting world, they do this all the time. When we used to do team startup in a rapid fashion, we would walk people through a process to do this, but it's almost always overlooked. One experience I had was responsible for helping build frontline supervisory training while I was at Verizon. And you can imagine that's thousands of frontline leaders. And one of the things we wanted to start with was this. We wanted the frontline leaders to really be able to talk about why. Why is your group important? Why is it important to you? What jazzes you as a leader for that? Why should your team members kind of get excited about it? And at the time we were designing this exercise and trying to get ready to go through this, we thought, well, this won't take very long. We'll practice it, we'll refine a little bit, and move on to the next thing in the training program. And what we found out was, not only did we have to spend more time on it, people had a very hard time thinking about this, and maybe even the harder part was, how do I articulate this? How do I share this with someone else in a way that makes sense, right? And so if you stop and think about this, the second question, what is inspiring about the future, about where you're going, is a really kind of interesting thing. We found that people could not articulate that. So we had to back up and start to think about, well, why is that important? And why do they have a commitment to going there? Because you can kind of get the idea of going through this. So what's funny about this to me is, first of all, this is a moving target. And so I think to my lead in, why is leading a highly effective team so hard is you have to constantly do this, right? And I think one of the, we are going to be going through this pandemic for some time now, and hopefully the very smart people who are looking at vaccines and treatments will figure out how to do that sooner rather than later. But while we're doing that, we're going to have to adjust and pivot like we're doing tonight in all kinds of places, right? That means that my answer to this question has to be revisited all the time. Like I kind of knew that, but in March it came home very, very clear. And as I've gone through here and we start the summer, I've had to do that again and again to think about where are we going, what exactly does that look like, and what is so important to us as we try to get there and how we can adjust, right? The last question on this page is really kind of interesting, and as we work with leaders across a lot of organizations and give feedback, this is also a question that we find people don't have an answer to. They hadn't really thought about articulating why they lead, why take the role, right? And there's a lot of reasons, and they're legitimate for the folks who answer them. But the interesting thing about why you lead and exploring that will take you on a journey for what's your motivation as a leader, right? There's a lot written around things like servant leadership and other types of leadership. We're going to explore leadership style here in a little bit, but some of the basics to understanding your style and why you lead a certain way is literally why do you lead. So Bill George wrote a book called True North, Lead Gen Set Exercises to think about this. If you haven't kind of gone through this exercise for thinking about why you lead, I highly recommend it because it's a nice piece on your own leadership exploration kind of thing. All right, so you're going to hear me talk about leadership as a central figure to highly effective teams. That's not surprising. What I want to do is talk about how that in particular is shifting a little bit, and then why it's hard to kind of get over it. And then we will spend a little bit of time exploring what you think about it. And in this format, we're going to have to be flexible for how we do that. But I think we'll have some fun kind of thinking about what this looks like. So I would argue that the role of leadership is more important than ever. And you've seen a lot of things over the last couple of years for what do leaders do in this environment. If you grant more autonomy, if people are essentially leading themselves on what's the role of a leader, we actually think that's really important and actually even harder than it was before. And here are some of the things that we're looking at. So this is a Boston Consulting Group paper called Bringing Managers Back to Work. It's a great read, but essentially, they're trying to make 2 points. One, of course, is to really unleash effective performance, you have to let people do their jobs. You have to get out of the way. You have to let go of some things, provide a context, and let them do what they do. So part of it is literally to create an environment and a structure where they can be successful if you let them be, give them some autonomy. Now, we'll come back to that in a second. But even more interestingly and maybe challenging is their perspective is that leaders, rather than being subject matter experts, rather than being command and control and necessarily focusing on approvals or tracking or metrics and all those kinds of things, one of the major roles is to become an orchestrator of the organizational behavioral system. That is, how does work get done? What are the constraints that my team runs into? How do decisions get made? How do we allocate resources? As a leader, I have to figure out, I have to crack that code so we can get really good at that so the people on my team can be very, very effective. And that actually is a very hard thing to do. So a quick example from my own experience, I spent 21 years at Verizon in the telecommunications industry. And of course, that changed dramatically over those 21 years from what a long time ago was a telephone company to what quickly became a data and software company and an internet company, and then later a content creation and TV provider and all kinds of other things along with the wireless business. In that environment, it was fairly flexible. It was a top-down organization, but there was a lot of autonomy granted. And over the course of 21 years, you figure out, well, how do I get things done? Who do I go to, and how do decisions get made? When I moved in 2009 into L3, the link simulation and training business, that was a completely different business. 75% of the business was DoD, driven by contracts and procurement and processes. For processes, it was much more structured. And how things got done and how things got allocated, where budgets came from, where your innovation dollars came from, all different. The language and finances, all different. So learning the language and how things got done took the better part of 18 months or so just to get a lay of the land for how that worked. And I flash forward to going full-time and working for a university. That's a completely different entity. It's a very decentralized system. It's the most decentralized system I've ever worked in. So trying to get things done in a place where you have a lot of flexibility but have to go find resources is also a completely different language. So the task of a leader in trying to figure out the operating system that their team works in and how you enable that team to go through and break down barriers is a very hard job. And I like that BCG is focused on this and trying as a leader to think about how you can do that. And in the environment you're working in is a very big deal. Now, the other places that is fascinating, and this gets a little bit to what I wanted to talk about in terms of the challenges for individual leaders, because in some senses, I'm not sure anything I've said yet is going to be new for you, right? In fact, I'm sure it's not. You're in a great program and you have some great experience. And in my experience, some of the matter is, well, how do I make that change, and am I making that change effectively? So on this chart, we see the role of a leader for teams is really changing, right? So from manager to entrepreneur, from tactical to strategic, from directive to instructive, and you can kind of go down this from problem solver to agenda setting, and you can see the things as the role of leader changes, so you can move quickly, so you can enable people to do what they need to do. These are very different skill sets. They're very different skill sets, and the challenge on a very personal level is many of us, if not all of us, and it's actually still true in a large part, learned a system of leadership that was much more on the left side. And much more focused on some form of control rather than enablement. And there are individual sources of knowledge and authority along this way that you have to break or change as you kind of try to make this shift, right? So, quick story in this regard: when I was at Verizon, I was asked to help with a development initiative to help our directors, middle-level leaders in the organization, get more strategic and think about their role a little differently. We really felt at the time that we needed that level of the organization to shift from operational efficiency to really helping the rest of the business think about, where does this business go and how do we evolve? It was an attempt at the time to push that level of autonomy, that level of participation in where the business was going down into the organization. The thought was we get too siloed and too bottlenecked if you let the top of the organization be solely responsible for strategy. What's fascinating to me is that was a little ahead of its time, and what we see now in highly adaptive organizations, the responsibility for what business you're in belongs to almost all levels of the organization. At the time in Verizon, it was a huge challenge, because what have we done over the last 10 years? We had hired all those directors and focused on the characteristics that would drive operational efficiency, on things that were logical step by step, on things that were tactically based, on process improvement. We didn't hire or focus or develop all these folks on scenario planning, the creative thinking needed to think about, well, what's our business model, or how do I map out our customer experience and think about what are the entry points for doing something different so we can change what we're doing here. It was a very big eye opener that trying to just change a piece of that system was a hard play. And that the pressure we're putting on leaders was immense to do that. And we see this all the time. And I think one of the things that is, I'm sure you've heard said before, and is striking to a lot of people right now, is the pandemic, among many other things. And of course, obviously, the terrific toll it's taken on people in our country and around the world. But it has accelerated the disruption that it started with here in the first slide, and has accelerated this transition of leaders at all levels to having to think strategically. And that's a very uncomfortable feeling. And it's hard because it's hard work, right? I used to facilitate strategic planning sessions for a number of years. And once you have a general direction, thinking about how you get there, I think leaders at most levels are pretty good at. It's what direction should we be going in? That question, what business are we really in? That's very, very difficult to try to get at, right? So leaders are struggling to adapt to this. And part of it's around role, part of it's around the set of skills that you're comfortable with, and part of it's around letting go. And so what I want to do is explore that. But Kate, I'm going to pause again and just see if there's any questions that have come up that we should address.
Perfect timing, because we have two questions.
All
The
right.
first one, and I see this all the time in graduate programs, how do you address the vacuum of leadership in a team of equals?
So that's interesting. if I can ask, if they don't mind, whoever asked that question, can you give me a little more background on what you mean by that? I can answer that, but I just want to see the context for that.
Hi, this is Dominic Locascio. So actually, I asked that specifically related to like an example like our study groups where, you know, there's no one who's specifically in charge, but we all have a goal to produce a certain output, but there is no leader.
So that's interesting. So I don't know, Dominic, I don't know if there's one right question to that, but what I have found, and if you look at that Google study that I referenced, they're going to talk about clear roles and structures for teams. So you absolutely can structure teams of equals, but then you need to probably think about who's playing what role and start to think about what your strengths and weaknesses are, right? And at the end of the day, and we're going to talk about this in a second, but Kate's not paying me about a slide, so I can skip ahead to content. Two of the biggest differentiating points for highly effective teams are how are we going to make decisions and how are we going to deal with disagreement, right? But in the case where you have all equals, you have to decide when we don't agree, how are we going to break that tie, or how are we going to come to any kind of a conclusion, right? And there's a number of ways to do that. But one of the things I'm probably about to go into is this idea of operating principles for teams. You call them norms, whatever you like to call them. But they're just agreed on how we're going to work. And we almost always, Dominic, we almost always suggest try to map that out ahead of time. Because if you walk into it, it's much harder to do on the fly, especially when there's either disagreement or conflicting goals. So on a team of equals, you can decide to be leaderless. You can decide to have a leader. One thing I do see a lot of is this recognition, and we see this not just in a team like your study group, but even in tech work teams, is this idea of the concept of what is emergent leadership. And that idea is letting the right leader emerge at the right time. So in a study group context, someone may have more experience, better knowledge, or just be better equipped to help you deal with whatever the case study is, or whatever the topic is, or God forbid, you're talking about accounting or whatever it might be, right? And so you rely on the subject matter experts and the leaders who are right at the time. That involves agreeing that you're going to do that and letting go of a role so someone else can pick it up. But in a team of equals, I think you still have to decide how we're going to make decisions, how we're going to decide what direction we go into, and it is going to involve some kind of a role or decision role, probably a leadership role.
All right. The next question is almost the flip of that. What is your opinion on the notion of leadership as a ship that needs only one captain?
A ship that needs only one captain. That's interesting. One of the things I think about leadership is and what we'll talk about tonight is that, you know, you have to pay attention to your situation, right? So I started with a little frame for the pressure on teams to adapt and to move quickly. Obviously, that varies by industry and by people and by parts of organizations. If I go to my good friends over at DART or at BNSF, I'm going to find a lot of focus on quality, safety, and the efficiency of their operations. So people can get from point A to B, or materials can get from point A to B. And so you'll see a stronger leadership role in some of those groups at some times, right? But I really believe that the captain should emerge when the problem is right for that particular captain to solve it, right? And so I really do think that at times as a leader, you should actually be a follower on your own team, because somebody on your team may be much better suited to solve the problem or to lead that part of it, right? I think there's a lot of pressure on leaders to always have the answer. And you really might be said, maybe it's better if you always have the question, not the answer, right? So a single captain probably fits some scenarios, but not many anymore. I think it's much important for leadership to emerge. And I'm going to reference a book as we go through here. Stanley McChrystal wrote a book called Team of Teams. You've probably seen it. If you haven't seen it, it's very, very interesting. General McChrystal was responsible for the Joint Special Operations Forces in the Middle East for a number of years. And as he evolved that organization, he clearly went to a situation that kind of broke the military's view of what was a formal chain of command to distribute responsibility for responding to a number of things in a really interesting way. he now actually consults in the corporate world. It's part of, I believe, Deloitte now. But they've really essentially thought about a ship having the right person at the right time to step up and lead whatever the problem is.
The next question is, how do you let go?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Some of it's around role and expectations, and some of it's around you have to kind of break your own belief system, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. But I think that the easiest way for me to think about that one is the easy realization to come to that the list of people smarter than me is long and growing. And if you do things like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and a lot of leaders have suggested, if you do a great job as you hire or select the team, and I realize you don't always get to do that, but sometimes you do. If you do a nice job of getting people in that group who are talented and smart and can do great work, it's around getting out of their way. It's reframing how you look at leading and letting go, right? And some of that is also around letting go when they are able to do those things. We'll talk a little about that.
Yeah, so Jim, sorry, this is Nicole, and I asked that question.
Yeah.
And maybe actually it's the last sentence that you just mentioned, but so like I walked in right out of college and I was a manager for 5 associates. They're all 40 and above, so of course that doesn't go so well.
Yeah.
But I don't tell them what to do. I ask, understand how it works, whatever. But when you then trust them to go do something and they mess up, and then it ends up it fires back in your face.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, then I don't want to let go.
Yeah, and that's something we hear all the time, and that's something I've faced, right? So a couple examples. When I was at Link and responsible for the HR function, as you might guess, we did business unit reviews, and those were done once a quarter by the president of a group of businesses, and that group of businesses is worth about $3 billion worth of business for L3. And in that environment, it was very high pressure. It was I walked in the meeting one day, and the guy who led our driver simulation business was presenting right before I was going to talk about 30 labor contracts. And as he did that, it didn't go well. And in fact, in the first 15 or 30 seconds, the group president told him that he was done presenting and had to get off the stage. And not all that was his fault. Some of what happened was his team didn't help him with the correct start to that presentation. Nonetheless, there were high consequences for failure. So everybody else, of course, is now very cautious, and they're micromanaging all the things that come that are inputs into that. I contrast that with a different environment where the consequences around failure are much, much different. We hear about these cultures of experimentation and learning and things like that. So part of the answer is a little more macro, and it's not always in your control. I realize that as I say that, right? But one of the reasons I mentioned that is sooner or later, all of us are going to be in a place where we're leading larger organizations. So it's really important to think about how you cascade your impact, right? To answer your question a little better, some of it depends on the consequences and what you're willing to do. I always like to let people try and fail before I take that away from them, and I try not to take it away from them. One of the things I see sometimes is, and I've done this myself, where I'll shield one of my employees from the consequences of what they did. It was whoever's giving me pressure, whoever's giving me negative feedback, whether it's a customer or my boss. Sometimes bringing that circle together helps with that. Part of it gets to how much time do I spend as a leader on coaching and development and context, and have I put them in a situation for success? And all these things are unique to the situation, right? So, but I would say is the other way to let go a little bit is to do that in concentric circles, right? Let go of some control if it goes well, let go of some more control, get them ready for the next steps, and do it in the stage of things. It's important how you start with this too. So I can't speak to the situation you're in. And I'll come back around this. Hopefully that's a start, but it can be very difficult, especially if there's larger consequences. Sometimes it's around enlisting stakeholders to minimize those consequences so you can teach people so they can learn.
Thank you, Green.
Jim, you've got 4 more questions here.
Sure.
All right, this one's a little long, so I'll read it slowly.
Okay.
When you unleash individual autonomy and initiative, maximizing people's freedom and exercising judgment in the completion of a task, can you simultaneously work towards keeping people from developing a sense of entitlement and demanding unreasonable things? I agree that developing highly skilled and autonomous employees are integral to developing an agile team that is reliable for success and performance without overbearing management. However, a common byproduct of this type of autonomy is an abundance of ego within individual team members.
Wow, so that's a lot of questions altogether. So I don't know any perfect way to do that, right? I mean, one of the things you think about as you go through here and why teams are so hard is you have a context and then you have individuals who you're leading in that team, right? And so you hear a lot of things about team composition, and the truth is teams are connected in different ways. And so a lot of the work is interdependent and they work with each other to accomplish an objective. A lot of the work is we're on the same team, but we're doing individual jobs and roles, right? The only way I know to start with that is some high touches around priorities and direction, right? The piece around purpose is also a piece around focus and direction, and getting good agreement around where you need to go, so that you don't have people not accomplishing the main mission while they're doing some other things they thought were important as well, right? And that's an art form, because if you fill their entire bucket up, they can't innovate. And if you give them too much freedom and you're not connected, and it's one of the reasons that people have so much trouble with leadership, myself included, is you have to stay continually connected, and you have to find the right rhythm for the individual involved to check in and do the prioritization. Now, the ego piece is a harder one. That's a harder one to try to get at. What I would think about when I think about that, I think about what's individual motivation, what is rewarding to them, and framing opportunities so that the outcomes there are mutually beneficial. They benefit them, whether it's acquiring skills or a reputation for something or financial rewards, while they benefit either the customer or the company. So it's about trying to figure out what's the intersection of their ego and motivation with where you want to go, and trying to paint that picture for them. Not always successful either. I'll be the first person to tell you that sometimes you get that Jim Roach guy and there's no holding them back, right? It's a hard deal.
Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.
As I told my undergraduates once, teams are hard because there's people.
There's people involved, exactly.
All right. Public services and business mostly serve different purposes. Are building effective teams for public service / politics and business different? How different? And what additional skills do the business leaders need to obtain before they decide to go into public service?
That's an interesting question. So I'll be the first person to say I don't know that I have a great experience set to answer the second part of that question, for the skills that are involved. I'll answer it this way. What I have found in the worlds that I've seen, right? And so if you take the example of stepping out of corporate life and what we see for leaders and skills and going into university, which at some levels is a very different entity, right? And Kate, this will probably sound familiar. So what I hear from my academic counterparts is, well, university isn't a business, and so we don't have to operate like the business does, right? And what's interesting to me is that's actually false, right? A university is exactly a business, but maybe more importantly, it's an organization, right? I think the answer to your question is, I think many of the leadership skills are going to be the same. Can you frame the purpose and the direction? I think those things are the same. What's the greater good, or the things you want to accomplish? Very, very similar. Do you have presence and communication skills, influence skills? Can you coalesce and align a team around where you want to go to do those things? There's a lot of context that's distinct for that, right? Some of the differences are, of course, motivation. Some of the differences are how you get things done. So one thing that may be similar is one of the things I've been involved with for the last 4 years is a HRSA grant. It's a partnership between UNT Health Science Center and TCU and a number of other folks over in Fort Worth. And we're working with teams of healthcare providers who are trying to affect positive outcomes and improvement in outcomes for geriatric patients. So these teams are across organizations, and they're trying to think about how do we improve things like dementia care, like fall prevention, like how do you manage your medications? How does a senior a geriatric patient actually reframe how they care for their own health when they talk to the doctor, not just take direction from the doctor, but participate in that. So I just take one of those things, fall prevention. And you think about who are all the people required to do a better job so that geriatric patients don't fall either at home or while they're out or while they're recovering. That's a system that crosses virtually all parts of society, right? So what we had to do was enable the leaders on that team to be able to cross organizational boundaries and draw people into a common mission. So that involved people from healthcare systems, from some nursing homes, from the area agency on aging, creating coalitions around various organizations. One of them happened to be the local fire department, because they show up at someone's house and deal with Jim has fallen over the ottoman in the family room, and how do we prevent that next time? So there are all those sources of education. So this is a rather long way of saying, in the social sector at least, maybe not the political end, but in the social sector, we have to get different constituents involved to solve a problem. Many of the same skills come to bear. We also do a program for economic developers. It's a national program we do with 3 other universities, and what our economic development professionals will tell us. So your Brandon McGinglebach, he is the president of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, and what he's going to tell you about how to get work done is he has to work with all kinds of area agencies, all kinds of constituents. And what Brandon will say is many of the leadership skills that he took from his corporate life are applied differently, but they're very similar in the public sector.
Okay, the next one is, do you think all team members should agree on the same goals from the beginning to accomplish success and avoid conflict or dispute during, or dispute during the performance of the missions? So should they agree from the beginning, or should they dispute during the performance?
Yes, I think the answer to that's yes. I think that you know why the team exists and what you're trying to do at the start has to be a conversation, and you should start with, well, what are we trying to do here, right? If we go back to where we started this conversation tonight, realizing whatever you're trying to do, life around you is going to change while you try to do it. That means that whatever your agenda is likely going to evolve in some way, shape, or form. I think that the goal of a leader, as you kind of go through that, is to align around a direction, provide the flexibility and the space to understand that direction may evolve. What did John Lennon say, right? Life is what happens while you're making other plans, right? That is going to move. We've all seen it. So the pandemic is one example. Changes in technology, competitors in the industry, something's going to change with your goals. The second part of your question, I'm not sure exactly what you meant when I heard it. Because what I heard is do we want to avoid conflict going down? That depends on your frame, but I would say that you want to welcome disagreement because that's going to make things, it's going to bring in multiple perspectives. If you can manage that well, which is a hallmark of a highly effective team, your output will be that much better. So we're going to see a chart up here in just a second around operating beliefs of leaders, right? One of those belief systems is leadership try to make decisions through consensus, which is an interesting goal versus leadership fosters disagreements. So we have multiple perspectives. Those are very different things. But when you think about where are you, what's your situation, you can enhance decisions with multiple perspectives. If you don't get disagreement, you're going to leave something on the table. Something might be left unsaid. And conversely, if you think about trying to make the best business decision, doing that by consensus is usually not the way to get there. So that's just a frame of reference to think about, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. In these unprecedented times, one might need the team to unlearn some things and reinvent. No matter how much you were charged as a leader, and willing to create opportunity, the best of the best could be unwilling. I assume that means people. How do you motivate the existing team to adapt quickly, learn, and survive?
That's a great question. And I don't know if there's one answer to that. That is a very difficult thing to do because we're not always aware of some of our paradigms. We're going to do an example here in just a second that asks us to think about some of our paradigms, right? There's a guy I work with, Michael Sheard, like many of the wonderful professors at SMU. Michael's in the faculty at TCU, but he has a set of strategic questions he uses with his client sets either when he's teaching or when he's consulting in the business world. And it's around trying to think about what are the paradigms you're using to understand the situation, and can you assess that and then match that again? Do they fit for the situation that I'm in, right? Some of that I think really gets to mindset. And Carol Dweck wrote that book around mindset and having a growth mindset, and you can think about that. But that's, we do some things around learning agility. One of the things to think about is just trying to be open to experiences, and it's a tough thing. The more experience you get, the more it tells you, the more success you've had on it. Doesn't guarantee it will be useful in the future. So I guess that is a hard thing to do. So I like the leader as teacher model for helping teams get to understanding different mindsets, as long as that behavior is also modeled by the leader, right? Trying to think about these things. So I would say mindset is the place to start with that. And then I think the other thing to do is as a team leader is to put people in places that they have no familiarity with, is to find assignments that stretch them because they don't have experience in those places. It's because it's those learning experience that will change your mind about something. So I think, one of the things that IBM does is something called experience mapping. And that's a fancy way of saying, as they look at the jobs in their organization, they think about, well, what are the experiences people usually had to get here? And so now how do we get people over here who want these jobs some kind of experience like that? And generally involves putting them in an unknown where they have no experience. How do we do this? They have to figure it out. That also is a great way to help people kind of get through that barrier.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. That was my question, because I come from an industry where we are hardcore on-ground kind of an industry, and we're trying to do a paradigm shift to, online, doing events and concerts, live concerts online, which is a technology driven thing. So from a physical thing to a the transfer into the technology, it's kind of very challenging.
Yeah, it can be mind-boggling as you kind of shift over and try to think about, well, how do we do these things, right? Experience I had along the course of my career that helped with that. When I was at Verizon, they tended to move people every 18 months or so. So you wound up in spots where you just had to adjust differently, right? So once upon a time, I was responsible for all the interviewing and selection that happened in Verizon. So my group, was comprised of me and 5 PhD IO psychologists. And by this point in the conversation, you figured out that I'm never going to be confused with a PhD IO psychologist, right? It's just not going to happen. And I realized really quickly I could not answer, if somebody came and said, well, what's the study we need to do to build this battery of tests? I didn't know the answer to that. They did, right? So I had to rethink what the job was, right? There's been a variety of places in my career where I just had to step into the unknown. That's probably why I stayed there for 21 years, is you just had to keep stepping into the unknown. So that's a piece of it, right? That's definitely a piece of it. It's a hard thing because to your point, we all have our own paradigms. You don't know what they are until you shift.
No, right. Like you very rightly said, it's the mindset, because the Adrian Rush, you're so good at your work, what you're doing, versus you're going to be judged on and, shifting it to a completely different platform. So it's the mindset, which we're struggling to get the team to kind of, adapt fast. So yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
All right, there were 2 comments, not questions, but I'll just read them to you, Jim, so you have them. The humble gardener, General McChrystal's best leadership metaphor. That was one comment.
Yes.
And the other it was what Jim just said about different perspectives and conflict is so invaluable to what we're going through right now with all the riots. So, and that was the end of the chat.
Ah, great. Yes. There's the thing that kind of goes along with some of those things that I've run into recently that I found very important was just the art of listening, right? And listening to understand, especially as it gets, you know, in the leadership context, to folks who are on your team and where they want to go with certain things. We do workshops on executive presence, and I'm sure you've seen these kinds of things, but one of the things that we spend some time is just literally the art of listening, and its application to all these subjects is really kind of invaluable. And as leaders who are under pressure to move quickly, it is very difficult sometimes just to stop and try to understand and make sure you understand. So that I think is a complementary skill to all that. So let me, we'll take some more questions in just a second. I want to kind of take you down a little path and really to this subject for where do some of these paradigms come from and how can you stop and think about it as a leader as it relates to kind of leading teams, right? So in a different setting, we do this exercise a little differently. So I'm just going to walk you through the question we ask and try to get at it, right? So little exercise that we sometimes do is called how should leaders lead? And in this example, we think about the competition that's going on in the cloud computing world. And so you can see a little clip from one of the business publications around the Pentagon choosing Microsoft over Amazon. And when we look at those two organizations, they're faced with some similar things. They're trying to be competitive in a very competitive cloud computing world. There's a lot of competition. There's a focus on improving results and increasing their business. And those cultures are very different, and they're very different in terms of the response. And so as it manages performance, Amazon is a much more hands-on and much more structured organization, much more likely to have detailed objectives and rigorous performance kinds of assessment. And even to the point where you might see some tools like stacked ranking, which essentially says we're going to rank everybody in our organization from top to bottom, and we'll invite the bottom 20% to pursue other career opportunities, and we'll hire some new people, and we're going to continually raise performance. It's a very focused effort on trying to raise the bar in terms of performance. Microsoft, on the other hand, looks at that question about how do we get more competitive, how can we get a little creative, how can we get increased results, and says what we need to do is give people more room to be creative, less rigor on some of these other performance dimensions, give them some more autonomy because they'll come up with some new ideas and we can't micromanage that. So the question we tend to ask leaders is, well, which is the right answer? How should people lead? And what's interesting as we go through that conversation is, of course, we get both, right? And actually, depending on the audience you ask, I would say it was about split 50-50, especially if I reframe that question a little bit. If I say performance is down and you need to improve it quickly, then people will very much go to a more structured, more tail-oriented approach than a Microsoft, more autonomy approach. And of course, this is a little bit of a trick question in that the right answer is it depends on your scenario and the people involved. But it's not a trick question, and then what we're really trying to get is what's your default? What's your paradigm? To some of the questions that were just asked, where do you individually start as a leader and how do you know? And how then can you adjust if you need to adjust, right? So I mentioned there'll be a quiz, and so we're gonna do this and what I'm gonna do is give you, if you don't mind, it's true, false. So you got a 50-50 shot. So I want you to take just about a minute or so. And so I'm going to be quiet here and let you go through these 5 questions and just decide for yourself, are they true or false? And then we're going to come back and talk about them. So I'm going to pause and hopefully we'll have Kate back so we can kind of process through what we all think of this. Kate, I'm guessing you heard all that, but we're letting them do the quiz you see in front of you.
Oh, I'm listening to every word.
Every word, yeah, I get that a lot, yeah.
I have been here. In fact, I just took the quiz myself. And I feel like sometimes how I want to lead and what you're going to say is the right answer.
Well, that's part of the heart of the matter, right?
That's right.
So let's we'll go through it. I'm sure some people will done very, very quickly. Kate, is there a way to open up some mics so I can get some volunteers, or?
Yeah, they can open up their mics themselves. So anybody who
Okay.
wants to jump in, or we should be able to, you all can do a hand raise and I can call on you.
Whatever works. I just would like.
All right, well, let's try the jumping in, and if people get frustrated, they can raise hands.
I know we have a large crowd, so it's a little hard to do. So, but let's just try to get some responses just to see what people think.
Right. Lily, I just saw you respond. If you want to jump in.
Yeah, take the first one. The employees need to be told what to do. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't want to overstate, because obviously you have to understand what your responsibilities are. But I think, once you have an employee who knows what their responsibilities are, you don't necessarily have to constantly tell them how to do their job.
So your answer is?
My answer is false.
False. Okay, good. All right, false. All right, and so it's interesting, and thank you for going through what you did, right? And so as you stare at all these questions, some of them have answers that are backed up by research, and of course, the answer to some of these questions is going to be it depends, right? When we do this in larger audiences, we get kind of a split, right? So let's see if anybody who would answer true for this would be willing to share their thoughts.
I said it's true because personally, I think even if they know what they need to do, but they still need to be reinforced, and it's like creating a process and accountability of doing that task rightly. So I would say they need to be told for sure.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. Thank you. And so you're going to get both sides of the question, right? And so what I really need to do is,
we had somebody, Elizabeth Mayberry, answered sort of.
Sort of. Well, let's hear what sort of means.
So this is Travis Mayberry with Elizabeth Mayberry. I'm tagging along here tonight. So
it's Travis posing as Elizabeth.
That's right. Less beautiful version. So employees sometimes need to be told what to do, but I think there's a freedom there that is kind of inherent with, they have the job, they earn the job, right? So there's some level of tell them what to do, but there's absolutely a freedom that they need to have to be able to do their job the way that you hired them to do it.
Exactly, right? So there's a judgment involved in it, right? Which is the heart of the question, right? And so everyone's answer is going to be situationally correct for whatever you're dealing with, right? But interestingly, what we have found, and what I've found over the years of practice, and what researchers say is leaders tend to have styles that they go back to. They learn from their experience. They learn from what jobs have told them, and they tend to default to some of these times. And what I would like you to think about as you look at this, and what we work in practice on to this, is really around getting more accurate each time you do something, right? Each time you look at something, try to look at it with fresh eyes. If my default is people need to be told what to do, it may come from a place where they're new in their job, new to the subject, new to the situation, and I need to provide more direction. If I think people don't really need to be told what to do, I'm going to lead in a different way. And it's really around getting the situation right. And it's also really around thinking around, well, what's your ultimate intention? Because we know autonomy is highly motivating. It's also highly integral to really effective teams. So you got to let go. When we work with leaders, we find, of course, nobody in about 170 people on the call, no control freaks on this call. I could tell, Kate assured me, myself included, but letting go sometimes depends on what's your operating principle. What we suggest is just trying to think about where do you start and try to analyze, is that accurate? Is that right? Most people do not like being told what to do. They don't want to be told what to do. And general direction is going to get you a little further, although sometimes you have to step into that, right? So it's a little bit of art and science. So that one is it depends, but think about where you start. So once upon a time, I got promoted at Verizon. So now I'm leading a group of 12 people who used to be my peers. And truth be told, I'm not sure how that happened. I don't know why they picked me versus somebody else on that team. I will tell you that they were great. It was probably the most talented team I ever had a responsibility for leading. And fortunately, I was at least smart enough to get out of their way. And that was some kind of a miracle, right? Because some of the leadership models I had in the past were a little more tell them what to do, which would have been highly ineffective in that situation. And so you can map that to where you are. And really, for you, me, and everybody else on the call, it's really not around one way or the other. It's been on the margin. How do I get a little better at it? How can I let go a little more? And where can I do that? All right, so number 2, work should be fun. Anybody want to tell me true or false?
Nicole Chevins, you have your hand raised, probably about something else. But since your hand's raised, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, this probably
I
wasn't
really like the idea of
answer.
I really like the idea of gamification of work. You know, if you can, as a leader, as a manager, making work fun, I think it's a very productive thing to do.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And in this particular case, on this dimension, what research will say is yes, you should try to make work fun. And what happens in reality, of course, is how am I interpreting that word fun, right? It's so funny to watch large audiences go through this, and the people were perplexed when you said, well, work should be fun. They're like, work's not fun. Work's important. Work's not fun. And of course, for all the healthcare workers who are taking care of us, we want them to be very focused on our healthcare outcomes. But if you ask, and we do a lot of work with healthcare systems, they find a way to have fun in their job, even under high pressure situations, right? So there's a lot of science for what's your thought around the environment, and work should be fun. And if you can lighten that up a little bit, there's a lot of ways, as you said, to engage. Kate, we go to 10, right? No.
Sure,
So,
sure.
I'm gonna
We can go to 10.
We don't want to do that. Let's go to number 4. True or false? Work should be structured to be as efficient as possible.
Okay, so this one I would say true. This is Nicole speaking.
Nicole, okay, so why true?
What?
Why true?
Okay, well, it's possibly my background, but so I worked in the hotel industry. So I just think efficiency is the best way. First off, if you can keep your employees doing stuff shorter, it allows them for opportunities for them to grow. Efficiency is better for profitability. I don't know. I think efficiency is just always the right way to go.
So it's hard to argue that we don't want to be more efficient, right? And we don't want to be more productive, right? This actually gets to be an operating principle that you might want to violate for certain scenarios, right? So play this out, right? If your goal is innovation and creativity, then work should not be structured to be as efficient as possible, because you're going to fill everybody's bucket up and they won't have any time to do that. So your answer is entirely correct for certain sets of objectives. I mean, it's very hard to argue with. What we see now, and the reason I started with the slides around disruption and the things that are changing in industries, is we see this increased pressure on leaders to be able to do both. You lead whatever group it is. And you're responsible, for operational efficiency. It has to go well. The quality has to be there for your customer. But at the same time, you're now more responsible for, well, what's our business model? What's our value add to the business? We need to think about how do we grow that and evolve it. So again, this is the trick of these operating principles is to try to step back and think about, does this apply to where I am now, where we're going, and am I overplaying something? And so that's the part. The last piece of this particular quiz is actually an operating principle that Stanley McChrystal used in the book Team of Teams and in his model. And it's an operating belief around most people are very capable in getting the right information and the support. They'll come up with the right answer 95% of the time. If you believe that, if you think it's true, then you let go of some information. You know, let people make their own decisions. If you think it's more like 40%, you're not going to do that. Now, in his environment, he realized they couldn't have a structured chain of command from frontline leaders in where they were operating all the way up through 6 layers of organizations, then back down again. It takes too long to do that. And that is true across a lot of industries. So the point I kind of go through this quiz is really just self-reflective. And for leaders, we actually have, as you might guess, a longer quiz that starts to get at things like, do you believe most employees can be top performers, can be excellent performers? Which is a really interesting question. And of course, honestly, in reality, most employees are not going to be top performers. But if you start with that belief, you do very different things as a leader. If your employees believe that you think that they can be a great performer, they're going to trust you a little more. So WD-40 is, of course, one of the two things you need to fix any household major repair at all. Duct tape and WD-40 will fix your air conditioning unit, the front door, whatever it is. I mentioned WD-40 because they revamped their whole performance management system on the belief that our goal is to make everybody an excellent performer. We know that's not going to happen, but we're going to work with that gym guy to see if we can't get him there. Now, what happens when you trust somebody because they're trying to invest in you and make you a top performer is when they give you feedback, you hear, well, Kate's got my back. She's telling me this so I become a better performer, not so she can manage me out of the organization. You get a different result. So some of these operating beliefs really land interestingly as you try to motivate the people on your team. Kate, let's see if there's a question here, and then I'm going to keep going here and with a little high-level tour of some of the other things we see.
I don't see any questions. They were just responses and comments to the quiz. So.
Okay.
Is it okay for me to ask a quick question?
Sure.
I go by TAN, like the color.
Yeah.
I've run multifunctional teams, meaning that they were. We used to have a small family business, which meant I was in charge of inside sales staff, outside sales staff, technical staff, and I guess the one thing that I'm kind of hearing you talk about, and it kind of bothers me, especially with that quiz, was that I could never treat them the exact same way. If I treated my inside sales staff how I treated my outside sales staff, somebody was going to quit. Expecting my technical people to think like my salespeople do was not a reasonable piece. But I spent probably half of my business day playing, I don't know, I guess the word would be basically being like a nanny, and getting these different groups of people to cooperate on the same problem. And you know, the questions you ask seem pretty absolute and don't talk about something like cross-functional teams, which I feel like in the modern business environment is becoming more and more common.
So that's a really interesting point. And I actually would expand on what I said to say that when it gets down to leading people, you actually have to lead individuals. So I'm actually with you on, you're going to lead differently based on the situation and based on the individual. You just absolutely have to flex. And that's one of the reasons it's so hard, because you're right. What motivates inside salespeople is going to be different than what motivates outside salespeople. What motivates engineers, very different from IT people. Even though on the surface you think they're all technology people, you get a very different mindset with different paradigms. And part of the art and science of highly effective teams is actually managing the individuals and not neglecting the one-on-one conversations and the differences that you have. And so one of the things we work with, and another one of these true-false questions is consistency the same thing as fairness? And the answer is no. They're different concepts, right? You don't have to do the same thing, or in fact, that will get you to a bad result. So I'm with you on that one. All right, so I'm going to take a little tour here, and I'm going to go a little faster because I know we want to end here in just a little while, and so I want to leave some time for questions. This little slide is adapted from the Hay Group, and to the point around understanding your paradigms is really a very simple model. It just says who you are, the set of beliefs, experiences, values, and preferences you have impacts how you lead, right? So it gets to kind of the thing that we're talking about here. And that the how you lead can impact the climate. That is, how does it feel to work for you? What the Hay Group, now part of Korn Ferry, what the Gallup folks will say is 70% of the motivation that people have and the climate they experience comes from the direct leader, from you, the leader of the team, whatever role you are. And as you can improve that climate, you'll have a dramatic impact on results. In fact, up to 30% of the variability in results comes from the climate you create. So the journey around where you've come from, the things you believe, and the style that you show as a leader, and your ability to flex that to the point that was just raised, become what are critical success factors for being able to lead a team better. And so it's really around matching to the situation and to the last point that was made to the individual and having some flexibility with that. So we see that quite a bit as we work with teams. So excellent leadership, purpose are two things that we see impact teams. You have a slide on operating beliefs. And since I want to kind of wrap a little quickly here and go through some things, I do want to point out the slide. Not to say that one set of operating beliefs is better than another, but what I'd love you to do following this session is to think about your own sets of operating beliefs. We talked about the first one, right? We talked about leadership reach decisions through consensus versus if you can encourage multiple perspectives, actually maybe some conflict during decision making, that will lead to a different thing. And you can see some of the other things on here. What I would suggest that you do is circle one of these and think about, so it could be number 5 is a comparison. Leadership is about problem solving versus leadership is about agenda setting, which is a really interesting balance, but about setting an agenda to the point about how do you let control go? The question was raised earlier. Rather than trying to solve a problem or specify the problem, if you can set an agenda with the issue, even if you have an idea of both of those things, but if you can let your team find its way through whatever the agenda is to naturally identifying the problem and then solving it, it's a slightly different role of leadership as you think about that. So this table is something that I found very useful for myself. Mentioned earlier around the ability to let go of some stuff because there's going to be some failure is actually the 8th piece here is compensation the best reward for good performance. That's one way to look at it. We don't work for free, so it's a great reward. But autonomy can be the reward for good performance. So one way to let go with people is as they have success to grant them some more autonomy. So that's another way to look at that. So that's a tool to leave you with. I'm going to go past this one to this one. I mentioned this earlier, operating principles are actively established. That's a best practice for why some teams are much better at it. Operating principles are all the discussions around how do we make decisions, how do we handle conflict, what's okay in our team, all those kinds of things. I had a number of leaders early in my career demonstrate that skill, and I was really amazed at it. So the first role I had, the first job I had at Verizon was to develop leadership development programs, and ran into our vice president of human resources, who was essentially 4 levels above me in the organization at the time, who had a conversation with me and the other folks on my team around, look, I always need to be candid about where we're going to go, and if you think something that I say is either a bad idea, and he used language that was a little differently than that, but it was clear for what he meant. If it was a poor idea, he wanted us to tell him right away. Which was to me at the time, I'm younger in my career, I was absolutely surprised that he was that open and wanted that level of conversation and really invited debate. And that's an example of an operating principle that gets spelled out ahead of time. I had senior leaders who would tell me, look, I'm going to come up with some ideas and then need you to tell me, are they relevant? Do they fit in our priority list? Are they doable? How much resource would it take to do those kinds of things? The set of decision points and the way that you like to work as something for teams is really easy to establish if you do it when you start. If you try to change it later, it's hard to do. It's much harder to do, and you're probably trying to change it later because it hasn't gone well. So there's this idea about how do you make decisions, who's going to be involved, who breaks the tie. We talked about team of equals before. You might decide in a team of equals we're going to vote. Hopefully you don't have an even number when you try to do that. But how you make decisions to move away from consensus into a frame that's around how to make the best decision for the scenario. And of course, it could be the situation, right? So norms vary based on the, so if I'm talking to a surgical team and thinking about how they make decisions in the operating room, I don't want a lot of debate, especially if I'm the patient, right? I want them to make a good decision quickly. So there's that comes along with it. The other operating decisions that you tend to see is how do you disagree? And this one actually turns out to be a hugely important thing. And a number of things have been kind of written around it, from 5 dysfunctions of a team to crucial conversations. Google saw that in the way that they looked at their study to build the perfect team. The reason I like this book, Overcoming the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, it's a field guide. So there's an exercise in there. Patrick Lencioni has written the first book. This is the second book, but it actually provides you an exercise for how do we develop the operating principles for disagreement in a team. It's very easy. It's practical to go through. It's not the only way to do it, but it's a way to do it. But from decision making to what's okay for timeliness to cultures around debate, for how we're going to handle all kinds of situations, building operating principles ahead of time becomes really, really important. And you can get kind of granular with that. On one of the previous slides, we talked about how you make decisions. Do you need all the data before you make a decision? But if you're the Mayo Clinic and you're the Cleveland Clinic and you're trying to take a research study and make it into a practical medical application, you might need as much data as you can. Of course, what we're finding here in this pandemic is they're probably going to have to make some trade-offs with those kind of decision-making norms, and it's knowing when to do that, even if you've established it. So these are the kinds of things that we see. Now, a couple of quick stories on this one. When I was at Verizon, I of course was at Verizon before it was Verizon. I started for a company called GTE, and as many of you know, GTE and Bell Atlantic merged to become Verizon. What was interesting about that merger were many, many things. GTE was a very people-centric organization. Bell Atlantic was a very strategic organization, great strengths in some different places. To say they did resolve differences differently was a tremendous understatement. So in the GTE culture, if there was a disagreement in a group of people, in a meeting, in a room somewhere, whether it was virtual or in person, if it didn't get resolved very quickly, it got stopped and got resolved outside of the room. So people would talk about it not in front of the group, but one-on-one later. Sometimes it involved whoever was leading the meeting or leading the group. But it was almost a passive-aggressive kind of, we don't want to get into that. Bell Atlantic and that culture was the exact opposite of the spectrum. Issues got put on the table. Things got heated. They were fine with that. They used some colorful language as things got debated. It wasn't personal, but it was intense. Maybe not always the way you do it, maybe not always healthy, but it was, we're going to decide in the room and we're all going to get together and figure this out. One interesting thing about that merger, certainly not for every group under the sun, but as a whole for the culture, what happened was a middle ground for how those, it came together in a really nice way for we're going to have healthy conversations in the room to make better decisions, and we want multiple perspectives. It actually worked well because we focused on it well. So those are the kinds of things. So Kate, I know we're at near the end of the hour. I want to stop there on operating principles and just see what kind of questions people have that I can answer before I wrap this up.
There are none in, nope, none in the chat. Does anyone have any questions as we're wrapping things up? I mean, this was at a very advanced group. They had all their questions at the beginning. They came full of questions.
They are a very advanced group.
Yes.
So just a couple thoughts on operating principles. Always set them up front. Always establish your norms up front. We used to build these starter kits for new teams. And in those environments, like the environment I described at Link, we had people start teams all the time. And we gave them some tools to do that, and it really had a nice effect. You're going to have to then, to the question around how teams work, adjust that. So if we think about agile teams and disruption and that their environments change, it means your operating principles, like your leadership style, have to evolve and fit the situation for where you are. And you have to be cognizant enough to think about how are we working together? How am I leading? So you can adjust it on the fly. And the last thing I'll say about that is, if you can spend more time, we talk to leaders a lot in terms of how they spend their time and how they see their roles, which is something we didn't get into tonight. What I would say about some of the communication aspects in teams is it just simply takes a lot more time than you think, and you have to kind of carve out time to do it so you can make the impact you want to have. With that, I'm gonna stop one last time to see any last questions before I kind of wrap something up here.
I don't see any more questions here. There's a thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate everybody putting up with me late into the evening, especially virtually. It's my pleasure. One of the things I always say is if I generated a question that you want to ask now, but you want to ask later, please, Kate can help you find me. I'd be happy to talk more about all these kinds of things. At the end of the day, when you look at what Google did in terms of their quest to build the perfect team, if I had to sum it up, it's paying attention to the process, not just the results. I think sometimes we're so results oriented and it's a strength and a run at where do we want to go? Let's accomplish this, boom, go on to the next thing. But the how you get there and the art and science into the gentleman who described leading multiple kinds of teams within, it's a complex moving equation that you have to pay high attention to. There's a slide on virtual teams, and there are certainly some differences there for what you do to engage people in a virtual team. but actually, one of the things that is an important aspect is really starting with purpose and maybe spending more time in purpose and enrolling people in the purpose and spending more time up front to do some of those things in norms as well. So with that, I'm going to end. I'm just going to say we're at 8. So I tried to never go over time. Thank you for the opportunity, and glad to be with you tonight.
Thank you, Jim. We appreciate it. Many of you know if Jim was here, even though he has to hide it at home, we'd give him a nicely logoed SMU mug or something wonderful to have there. So we really appreciate it. A couple people asked how they can reach out to Jim. For everyone except for our JD students, you will get an email afterwards with Jim's contact information. And Arma, I saw you ask the question. So just email BLC and we will be happy to share Jim's contact information with you. And I know he would love to answer your questions. So thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Those of you in the MBA program, good luck on finals next week. And we will see you in Mod B.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. I always let it kind of dwindle down in case someone has a last minute question here.
Absolutely.
It's nice to see you again, Jim.
Very good to see you. I'm looking forward to the day we can do this on campus again.
Me too. And remind me the next time you're on campus, I'll tell you about the different cultures of when I worked for Dr. Pepper and we merged with Snapple and Mott's.
There's good stories there.
All right. Good night, everyone. I'm going to end it.
Good night.